Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
NIH funding touches far more than major research institutions. A new analysis maps how those dollars support jobs and businesses nationwide. United for Medical Research's latest report breaks down the geographic reach of that impact and why timing matters as budgets tighten. Joining us to walk through the findings is Caitlin Leach, president of United for Medical Research. Caitlin, it is great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Terry. Nice to be here.
United for Medical Research has just released its 2026 update on the economic impact of NIH funding, National Institutes for Health. And it opens with what I find a pretty stunning statistic, a 250% return on every dollar of NIH-funded research. Start at the top and walk us through that multiplier effect.
Absolutely. So our report shows that NIH research doesn't just drive medical breakthroughs, it's also a driver of our economy all across the country. So the $36.5 billion awarded to NIH-funded researchers in fiscal year 25 supported more than 390,000 jobs and generated more than $94 billion in new economic activity nationwide. So that's that 250% return on investment. For every dollar NIH spends, our economy generates about $2.57.
You've been watching this for a while. Is that a fairly consistent number? Does it surprise you?
It is relatively consistent. There is some variation every year, but we do see that NIH is a consistent economic driver. When Congress appropriates money to NIH and that money gets out to grantees all across the country who are investigating really interesting ideas to improve health across lots of diseases, as long as the money is spent, we're seeing that economic benefit.
I think a lot of people think about NIH as a place for scientific discovery, but not necessarily how that discovery gets made. So talk us through that from a dollar in a NIH research grant. Where does it go? What kind of jobs get created? What generates that economic impact?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say the scientific advancements are a really important outcome in and of themselves of the research. And in some ways, other analyses have shown that the investment in NIH actually does save money in healthcare costs in the long term. But what we're talking about are the direct jobs that an NIH grant supports, maybe at a university or another research institution, and then the indirect jobs and economic benefits that happen as a result. So a research lab might buy equipment or tools that they use to enable their research. So the jobs both in the lab and then the jobs of the research enabling companies and tools and the manufacturing of all those products are all indirect jobs that are created because of NIH research. And then we also see the economic multiplier from all of those jobs and all the purchases of research goods and related services have a ripple effect in economies. So as people are paid, they're spending their money in their communities, maybe making purchases and dining out and other things. So the economic activity is also from that full life cycle of a dollar as it moves through our economy.
One of the striking findings in the report is how widely NIH funding is distributed across the states and communities. How does that geographic spread change the way policymakers might think about the investments in NIH?
It's really important and it's everywhere. So our report illustrates that there aren't just economic benefits in the places you might think, maybe Massachusetts or California, large states with research enterprises that are really well known. We see the benefits everywhere. So states like Alabama and Maine and West Virginia have that same economic impact, and it ripples maybe even as a greater impact in these states. So every member of Congress and our policymakers should care that NIH is strongly funded and consistently funded, because that money creates immediate jobs and economic impact. It also brings research to every state. So clinical trials are reaching constituents everywhere, and it's growing states' biomedical research capacity in places where that already exists, but also in places where that is emerging. So we think it's a really good investment everywhere, and we hope that policymakers see this information and understand the economic benefits for their communities.
I'm speaking with Caitlin Leach. She's president for United for Medical Research. Caitlin, you said that this multiplier effect has been fairly consistent for years, but 2025 was a tough funding year for NIH. They were in the headlines a lot. There were a lot of grant programs that were interrupted or stopped permanently. Talk us through how all of that disruption in 2025 impacted the medical research community.
Absolutely. So the top line from our report is that because NIH's budget was fully spent, despite the fact that it was spent maybe slower throughout the fiscal year than a normal year, because all of NIH's budget was spent, we saw about the same economic impact overall that we might see in a previous economic impact report. However, as you say, there was a lot of uncertainty. And so that does have an impact, maybe not at the end of the day in the dollars and in our economic multiplier, but the uncertainty itself makes it difficult for grant recipients and the institutions they work for to plan, to maintain their staffing levels, to make research-related purchases. So the impacts are real. And luckily, because bipartisan support from members of Congress across the House and the Senate and both parties really ensured that there were not major cuts to NIH and that in fact, the budget grew last year, was really important to sort of righting the ship during what was a very tumultuous time. So we're optimistic that what this report shows is that NIH can weather the storm as long as the funding increases are there and the grants are made to recipients and the dollars are getting out the door.
The report makes a really interesting point that I would love a little bit more clarity on. Multi-year funding. Typically, I think of that as a good thing. In a Department of Defense program where you have multi-year funding, it means that there's predictability to the program. The funding is going to be there for a long time. And folks like that because it adds some consistency. You make the point, though, that multi-year funding in NIH is not always a good thing. So tell us why that is different.
Yes, and it's a good point. There are times when a multi-year award is the right award for the type of project or for the investigator. And NIH has used multi-year awards at varying levels over the years. What we saw last year was because of the funding delays you mentioned, so it was a slow start to the fiscal year. And then by the end of the year, a lot of money went out the door very quickly. Awards themselves had to be larger. And so we saw an increased use of multi-year awards. So the proportion of the NIH budget that went to multi-year awards increased last year compared to previous years. And what that means in biomedical research, because of the way awards are typically funded, fewer awards went out the door. And so that means a lot of researchers were not funded. A lot of great ideas sit on the shelf. And for our economic analysis, likely if the money's not getting out into the economy, we're not going to see as great of the multiplier effect. So we're really watching closely to see the trends on multi-year awards going forward.
And in the biomedical space, does that also mean that you've committed funding to known projects, but you've sort of closed the innovation window? Perhaps amazing things might pop up 3 years from now, but you've already committed your funds.
Possibly, yes. We've heard arguments on both sides that it can be both stabilizing and more nimble, but I think you could argue either way. And I think that your point is absolutely right, that we do worry about all the amazing ideas that are submitted from researchers all across the country that are not funded.
As you look ahead then with this report, out the door, what are you hoping to see from legislators, from the leadership at NIH, maybe even from the research community in the future?
It's certainly my hope that NIH continues to have strong bipartisan support because disease knows no bounds. It doesn't know where you live or who you voted for. So we're really hopeful that members of Congress and agency leaders continue to steer the ship with strong funding to support the really exciting ideas that researchers have and to maintain the U.S.'s biomedical leadership all around the world. So it's a really important time, and we encourage continued strong investment in NIH.
I've been speaking with Caitlin Leach. She's president of United for Medical Research. Caitlin, thanks so much for joining me and for sharing this report with us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.